Welcome to the Cosmic Business Breakthrough Podcast. I'm your host, Sophia Pallas, and this podcast is for soulful entrepreneurs who want to harness the cosmic power of astrology to elevate their message, unlock flow, and attract their best clients ever. Join me every week and get excited to discover how you can use the energy of the cosmos to get the business breakthrough you've been waiting for. Welcome back. Today we are exploring the planet Mars. The planet Mars is one of the most important planets to consider in your entrepreneurial journey. This is where you get your motivation, your drive, your action-taking abilities. But it's also where you might come across your frustrations, your reactivity, and your anger. So getting to know Mars in your own specific birth chart is going to have a huge impact on how you do business and how you work with others. So today I have a very special guest to help walk us through how Mars shows up for different people in different elements. Her name is Alicia Yusuf. She is a consulting astrologer, counsellor, writer, and teacher who draws on 16 years' experience to guide her clients and students towards deep understanding and self-acceptance. What I love about Alicia is that she has such a warm, empathetic, and insightful and practical approach to astrology, and she has really helped me navigate my own journey of self-discovery, and she's really helped me understand a lot more about my own Mars. She has a very strong Mars in her chart, and she's really, really interested in this particular planet, and that's why I thought she would be an amazing guide to explore this key part of our chart and for you to get to know more about what's going on for you as an entrepreneur. So listen up, get comfy. We are going on a journey to Mars. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us on the show today.
It's my pleasure, Sophia. It's really lovely to be here and chat about one of my favourite planets, good old Mars.
Awesome. So you've written a lot about Mars over the years, and I would love for us to start by getting a bit of an overview on your own experience with this kind of challenging but also energizing planet. I know it's quite a big part of your own birth chart, and I'd love to know how it's been part of your business journey as well.
Mars is an interesting one. You know, I always think about it as that sharp edge, you know, like a sword, and you have to be careful how you use a sword. You can't just leave a sword laying around, but it's wonderful to protect and defend and go after what you want. And I have a strongly placed Mars in my chart, and it rules a lot of different areas in my chart. So I have Mars natally in Scorpio, which is that sign of intensity and power and of going deeply into things. You know, Mars in that wants to dive under, see what's beneath the surface. And it's placed in a certain area of my chart that's linked to psychology and depth work. So when I first started studying astrology and then working with clients, I just went, I need more than this. So I ended up studying counselling for 4 years. So I've got a graduate diploma in counselling as well, just so I could sit with clients in a deep way, you know, really be able to help them in that space and support them. And that is what I feel passionate about, what I feel driven about, you know, all those Mars words. And it gives me a lot of courage and a lot of inspiration when I'm in that space with clients. I also really see Mars as being able to cut through things, you know, that sharp surface. So I can sit with clients and help them clear away the dross, clear away the confusion, and really cut to the heart of the matter or the heart of what is going on in their lives as well. So that's one of the things I like to do. But I always think about King Arthur and the sword in the stone story. You know, he was able to pull the sword out of the stone with his strength, but he wasn't able to wield the sword very well. It took a lot of work with Merlin to understand his power, understand his abilities, and be able to get there. And I think for me, that did come later in life. You know, Mars can be that hot-headed, rash, irritated energy, frustrated energy. And it does take maturity and experience to get a handle on that as well. So I did spend a lot of my 20s and even early 30s trying to work out what I wanted to do and get a handle on Mars. And now in my 40s, it's when I'm really blossoming and blooming with this energy. And I feel like I know how to wield this sword. It's well balanced, you know, so I won't hurt others or myself with its energy. But yeah, I did have to really work a lot with Venus. And I always suggest this with Mars work is also working with Venus to help balance the sharpness and the directness of Mars. So
beautiful. And Mars is known for its courage. It's known for its strength and its power. It brings that energy to our life. But as you say, it also has that cutting energy. It has that aggressive energy as well. So you've really got to find a balance with your Mars so that it's not overdoing the aggression or the reactivity, and you're really using it in the most productive ways, particularly when it comes to working in your business. And I love that you acknowledge that that's what you do for clients when you have that powerful Mars, is you can just cut to the core of what's going on. But also, do you think that having a strong Mars yourself means that you're able to activate that in others, you know, maybe remind them of their own assertive power or their own particular energy that might be hidden?
yes, absolutely. You know, and I feel like I draw a lot of clients to me that need to or want to explore Mars or themes of Mars. So, you know, in my counseling practice, one thing I focus on with clients is anger, you know, and this is a very Mars thing, anger or rage or resentfulness or frustration. And I find with women especially, we have been trained or taught by society to discard our Mars or to ignore our anger or pretend that it's not there. You know, you have to be the good girl, otherwise you're the bitch, for example, or, you know, whatever that is, you know, those words that are put on women who assert themselves in the world. And look, now is a lot better than it was when we were growing up or even when our mothers were growing up. But there is that sense of when we own our anger, we are owning ourselves. Our anger is just a signal. It's not something good. It's not something bad. It's just telling us that something in the situation is wrong. It's how we choose to act out of that emotion that often gets us into trouble. And this is where being really conscious of our Mars, where it is in our chart, what planets it's conjunct, can really help us understand how we can consciously act with our Mars in a better way to get what we want. You know, Mars at the end of the day gives us the courage to go after what we desire. You know, it's like that Nike slogan, just do it. You know, that's what Mars wants to do. Just do it, just go after it. But there's all these layers of things that can get in the way. You know, one thing I think about anger as well, or Mars, you know, there's so much talk in self-help circles now about boundaries. You have to have strong boundaries. You have to have good boundaries, which is all wonderful. But if you don't have Mars there to protect those boundaries, then there's no point, because people will just go over the top of them, or to be able to assert those boundaries. So I think about it like, you know, the kings and queens of old living in their castles with the big moat and the gate, the fence around it, and then you've got the guards at the gate. And that portcullis goes up and down. You have to let people in. So if you have no guards, anyone can walk in. So Mars is those guards. You know, it's that signal that tells you, yep, this person's okay. This is all right. This situation is good. But hey, actually, I'm going to assert to say no to that person, or I'm going to assert to say no to that situation. So I think that's really where Mars can be very helpful in our lives too.
For sure. So in business, we often, especially the way that we do business these days in service-based businesses, we need to understand our boundaries and be really clear, often with our clients, around boundaries. So knowing how our Mars works, or knowing how best to work with our own Mars, can really help us to put those boundaries in place in a way that doesn't feel uncomfortable to us, that feels actually quite natural for our way of being, because some people's boundaries will be different. Some people will need those really, really, really firm boundaries, and other people might have a little more fluidity in the way that they set them, just because of the way Mars works in their chart and how effective it is. So you and I have worked a lot on my Mars is in quite a difficult position. It's in Libra, which is not in its favorite spot at all. It's in its detriment. So it has a lot of difficulty with setting boundaries. And this is where understanding your Mars can be really helpful to do business better. Because when you know you have difficulty setting boundaries, you can put other things in place to help you, or you can bring that to your conscious awareness so that you make sure that it happens. You make it a process in your business.
Yeah, absolutely. Mars in Libra, Mars in Taurus too. They're both Venus signs, and Venus wants to connect. It wants to bring things together. It wants to, smooth and soothe and calm and be charming. Whereas Mars is honest, direct. It's the warrior coming in with the sword. It's like action, let's go do it. So I always think about, for the Australian listeners, Peter Garrett, when he first went into politics, that activist energy. Peter Garrett is a very Mars type person. But when he went into politics, suddenly he had to do the charm and the diplomacy, and he couldn't get things done in his way. And he ended up just kind of going, that's enough, I've had enough, So that can be that quality, Mars in Libra especially. Mars likes to assert, and, it will get into conflict quite happily. But Mars in Libra is actually conflict averse. It's that sense of, I'd much prefer to do things in the peaceful way. How can everybody hold hands and connect here? So it's that, okay, which way am I going to do this? How am I going to do this? So it's knowing that conflict is inherent in all human relationships. It always will be. No one's ever going to want the same thing as somebody else 100% of the time. But how do we do conflict? Our Mars sign or our Mars signature can show us how we do it. So Mars in Libra, yes, you will approach conflict in a way where you want to be able to listen to all the voices at the table, but you still need to be able to protect and support your voice in that. It's not giving all the power away to everybody else in the room. So, that's that Mars in Venus ruled signs needs to remember that they are just as important as others.
Yes. Just on that, let's go a little bit deeper into Mars through some of the signs and where Mars is well placed and where Mars is not so well placed, and what that might look like for you in life and in business. So when you have Mars in a fire sign, so the fire signs being Aries, Leo, Sagittarius, what happens then? How does Mars work if you have Mars in a fire sign?
Sure. Mars is a hot, dry energy, and fire is hot and dry as well. And so when we bring it back to these basic elements, you can see that Mars feels comfortable in these signs. So it's able to be passionate, it's able to be dynamic, its courage and its boldness is easily expressed in those fire signs. So fire signs are about movement and about dynamism and about passion, and Mars is the same. So, for people in business who have Mars in a fire sign, they may find that they are pretty confident. They know what they want and they know how to go after it. And there is this sense of being able to cut through easily too. And I find Mars in fire signs, any Mars wants a mission. Mars wants to have a mission and wants to have a purpose. And so it can easily find whatever that mission is and go out of it. It's easily energized and inspired. That's what Mars in those signs wants to be. And look, this will be affected, of course, as the planets move around and how it impacts that Mars in our chart. But in general, it's like, okay, how can I go towards inspiring myself or, people who light me up, or situations where my spirit feels really strong. Those kind of adventures Mars in fire signs will like.
Yeah, so Mars in a fire sign, it's quite dynamic. It can be really intuitive and inspired. But do you think, though, with the extra hot energy, there's also that potential for more conflict potentially, like depending obviously on how the Mars is in the chart, because not everybody is going to have that same situation. But the hotter the Mars is, does that mean there's more likelihood of having a bit of a hot temper, for instance?
Definitely.
Yes.
And I think Mars in the fire signs, they will tell it like it is. They can be very blunt and very direct. And so some situations are perfect like that. I always think, think of a battle zone. You don't want to be going, hey, can you please pass me that bullet? You want bullet now, gun, that kind of thing. So it'll depend on where you are and what you're doing. So, for example, if you're a paramedic and you've got Mars in a fire sign, you're going to be awesome in that emergency situation. But if you're in a diplomatic role, then you're going to have to be careful about when you pull your punches, and when you deliver them. Also, Mars in fire signs craves freedom and independence too. So it can be that sense of knowing when, if you are working in a team, when you are able to go after what you want and look after your goals and your visions, and when you have to be more collaborative and maybe a little bit more tricky for you. And this is where other areas of your chart can help support it, but it's knowing when to pull that back. And I think it's really important for people to be able to honor that Mars and give it space. So, if you're in a role, you've got a Mars in a fire sign where you're having to be collaborative 100% of the time, it just may be too frustrating for you. So thinking about either a different role or asking for ways that you can have that space within your business.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. Especially if you're running your own team, you're leading your own team, it's probably really important for you, if you have Mars in a fire sign, to check in rather with how you are dealing with your team, that you're not being a little bit too blunt or too reactive as well, because that extra fire can make you react really quite quickly if something goes wrong, and that can potentially create dramas within the team and within the people that work for you. So it's something to be mindful of if you have team members, employees. You've got to be conscious of the way that your Mars works, that other people don't necessarily react in that same way or don't respond well in that same way. Okay, let's look at Mars in air signs next, because I guess there is a little bit of a similarity with the fire and the air, because again we're quite reactive in a way, because air is it's kind of combustive in a way as well. It's not a grounded energy. So how do people with Mars in an air sign, how might that present in life and business?
Air brings heat and moisture. So Mars likes the heat here, but the moisture can kind of soothe the edges of Mars here. It's not so much like the fire in that really sharp way, but it definitely has a busy mind. This is where energy really goes into the mental realms. So these may be people who like to assert themselves through their communication style and lots of ideas, and also that I find Mars in Gemini especially can be that kind of the sharp tongue, being that Mercury ruled sign. It's that sharp tongue or witty, that sharp wittiness. Comedians who have that kind of humor that really cuts through and has a bit of a ouch factor, but is also hilarious at the same time. That's what I often find with the Mars in those air signs. They're really good at networking and making connections with others as well. So, great for those kind of jobs where it's about communication or about connections or about networking. That's what that will want to assert towards. I also find Mars is really good in learning and researching, getting curious about things in the air signs too. And Mars in Aquarius especially is an interesting one, because Aquarius is so much about that higher mind, the ethics, the values and the morals of a situation. Mars in Aquarius will often really defend to the nth degree. Is this ethical? Is this right? Is this good for humanity? So there, I find Mars in Aquarius especially will be those activists, whether they're environmentalists chaining themselves to trees or looking for good ways to help the higher good or the human good with that energy.
Absolutely. And we did talk a little bit about Mars in Libra already. So we know, just to clarify, the air signs, Gemini, Libra and Aquarius, that is that more thinking energy, isn't it? So it's like a lot of action in the mind with Mars in an air sign. And that's something I've had to come to terms with myself a lot with having that Mars in Libra. But it is really interesting that we are chatting today, just a couple of days before Mars is going to move into Gemini from this weekend until next year, next March. So we are going to be experiencing a lot of this Mars in an air sign energy, and particularly that very curious and slightly scattered energy of Mars in Gemini. Just while we're talking about Mars in an air sign, how are you feeling about that upcoming kind of Mars in Gemini for an extended period of time? How are you feeling about that?
So Mars is usually in a single sign for about 6 weeks, but when it goes retrograde, so I'm sure your listeners have heard about Mercury retrograde, but Venus, all the planets retrograde, but it's the personal planets, Mercury, Venus and Mars, that we want to look to the most with the retrograde period. So it is going to be retrograde this year from the 30th of October all the way through until the 11th of January. And this is a period of time where Mars may go a bit haywire. And I always think about it like driving my car when in the old days where spark plugs weren't working. And so you put the foot on the accelerator and the car would surge forwards and then it'd stop and then it'd surge forwards and then it'd stop. You're like, oh my gosh. So that can be this energy. So it may be a sense of suddenly you've taken off. Mind is working overtime, lots of thoughts, lots of ideas coming through. And that dispersive energy of air can be like, okay, I'm interested in this. Suddenly I'm interested in this. Suddenly I'm interested in that. But then the stop happens and it's a much more internal energy. Suddenly energy drops and you don't have so much to do. I mean, my suggestion always with any retrograde period, but especially Mars retrograde, is to take projects off the back burner, retrograde, revisit, review, react, and not react as in reactive, but react on something that needs extra work that's been sat at the back. So personally, because of where it sits on my chart, I'm going to be revisiting some old projects around teaching. So understanding which house this retrograde will be in will be helpful to tell you, okay, where should I revisit or review or re-energize with this? But also just going quietly with yourself, knowing that period of time, energy levels may go up or may come right down. And I think for those who are Gemini rising, Virgo rising, Sagittarius rising, or Pisces rising, if you know your chart, this is going to be more strong and more obvious for you because it'll be happening in what we call the angular houses, the power houses in your chart.
Yes, for sure. And that Gemini energy is that awesome networking, curious, pulling everything together, kind of connecting the dots kind of energy. So you might find some really great inspiration comes through maybe before the retrograde while we have Mars in Gemini, and maybe that retrograde time is more of that kind of recalibrating. You can't necessarily push forward when Mars is retrograde. The energy just isn't there. So it's really about redoing things or reconnecting things that you've been working on in the past and maybe bringing a little bit more focus in, because Gemini can be quite a scattered energy as well, can't it? Like we might want to do all of the projects while Mars is in Gemini. We might find it really difficult to focus on one thing at a time. And that could be really good, especially if you, like me, that's quite, one thing at a time. Well, no, not necessarily liking variety. But so it can be good to bring a bit of change in. And it could be great for the people who love variety. And that could feel really exciting. It might be a bit destabilizing for those of us who are a bit more fixed in our ways.
Yeah, totally. It always makes me think of, magpies, like where's the shiny object next with Gemini? What's that bright shiny object there? It can easily be distracted. And it's giving it that broadness of scope, but remembering with this, it's like, okay, put the broadness within what's already existing rather than bringing new thing, activating towards new things under this Mars retrograde energy.
Yes, absolutely. So now we've spoken about a bit of the fixed stuff. Let's talk about the earth signs rather, like Mars in earth signs. So that would be Mars in Taurus, Mars in Capricorn, and Mars in Virgo, of course. Virgo is always a sign I don't know why. I always forget that it's an earth sign because it's kind of a little bit
with that Mercury.
less earthy than the other earth signs. But yes, so we've got Taurus, Virgo, and Capricorn, Mars. How would Mars operate in an earth sign?
And it's interesting with the earth signs because we've got Mars very well placed in Capricorn. It's in what we call its exaltation. So it's very happy and very energized there. And then Mars in Taurus is not so well. In the earth signs generally, it's a much slower pace, and it's very practical and very realistic as compared to like the fire and the air signs. So I find, Mars in earth signs puts its energy into building and creating, puts its energy into longevity and things that are really grounded. The speed that it moves at will be slower, and what people assert themselves towards will be way more practical and tangible than, say, the fire and the earth signs. They'll put realism and longevity over kind of the excitement and the passion that the fires and air signs will. I find they're also very logical. It's like, okay, I need to think this through before I can act on something, whereas fire will be like, no thinking, all action. So it's quite a different energy. And it has the dryness that Mars has, but, essentially Mars is hot and earth signs are cold. So it really cools down that Mars energy. And so I find that this is the hare and the tortoise. This is always the tortoise that wins the race if it gives itself the time to do it. And so I'm always suggesting to clients with Mars in earth signs, give yourself the time, give yourself the space. Don't expect that you're going to get things finished overnight. And also they may want to assert themselves into things where they can touch, where they can feel, or that it's about the body as well. That's very much that material, earthy, tangible realm. So yeah, they really enjoy that. When it's okay, I can take the stress and the pressure off doing this.
Yeah, and there is that kind of groundedness of Mars in an earth sign. So it does have that kind of more enduring power, especially Mars in Capricorn. That's why it's so good there, because Mars can do its thing for the long term, not just a quick spark of kind of activation and energy and then moving to the next thing. It's very much like doing the thing over the long term. That's why entrepreneurs with Mars in Capricorn can get so much done or have such great success because they just keep on going. They just get, like that Energizer bunny. They just keep on going. Although Mars in Taurus is not great, it's a Venus ruled sign, it still has that kind of very methodical step by step that the earth signs have. And the same with Mars in Virgo, can be very methodical in its processing and checking and, making sure everything is on track, which can be quite an effective place for Mars to be.
Yeah, Mars in Virgo. Actually, my daughter has Mars in Virgo, and she's very good at focusing on the details and seeing what's wrong. I've got a few different clients with Mars in Virgo who are either naturopaths or in some kind of medical industry where they're really good at diagnosis. That Mars can push through and see, okay, this and this are the problem, in amongst all the symptoms that are showing up. Okay, these are the two issues that are here. And Mars in Taurus is awesome for standing your ground. I find Taurus really inherently knows its own worth. And so Mars in Taurus is like, I'm not budging, I'm going to assert myself into here, this situation. So, yes, it can feel like it's slower, but, as I said, the hare and the tortoise wins the race. So it's really that idea of going slow to go fast with Mars in the earth signs.
Yes. So that brings us to Mars in the water signs. Now, this is the tricky one. Well, I'll let you explain this because you have a strong Scorpio placement. So I think we should start with Scorpio, given that Mars is quite at home in the sign of Scorpio. The other water signs are Cancer and Pisces, which are a little trickier for Mars.
Yeah, well, Mars in the water signs, it's the absolute opposite of it, isn't it? You've got a cold and moist environment. You're putting something hot and dry there. It's like, what the hell? But I also see it's like that sword that has been fired in the forge. It is tempered in water, so it can really bring a strength. But Mars rules Scorpio. Mars in Scorpio is that strategic energy. It's quite deep and it's definitely emotional. But it's like if Mars in Aries, which it also rules, is like the warrior on the battlefield who's in there and poking and, he's got his sword out. Mars in Scorpio is the general at the back of the battlefield going, okay, if I put my men here and my men here, that'll be a pincer move and we can win the war. So I find that it's really great for being able to have a more strategic approach to things. Mars in Scorpio as well tends to go at things from underneath. It doesn't want to necessarily come straight at it. I always think about Mars in Scorpio as like the assassin or the ninja.
Yes.
It is the night sign of Mars. So it's okay, how can I do things on the quiet, or how can I do things in that very mysterious and sometimes secretive way that Scorpio can do it. I also find that Mars is about pain, Mars is about blood, Mars is about all those kinds of things. And Mars in Scorpio is very good at sitting with people in pain, or in emergency situations too. They often have a cool, calm, collected head. And Scorpio in general, but especially Mars in Scorpio, is drawn to those risk-taking, almost life and death situations as well. I know people like Steve Irwin, for example. He had a Scorpio career line. Valerie Taylor, who people may remember, the lady who dived with white pointers, she had Mars in Scorpio or a Scorpio signature as well. So you may find people who it's risk-taking, but that real life and death edge. And I think that's why you'll find too, Mars in Scorpio, people who work in those emergency situations like ER doctors and people like that who are drawn to that adrenaline of Mars, but in ways that they can help and heal in the water signs too. But as for the other water signs, what are your thoughts? What are your feelings about them?
I have a few clients who have Mars in Cancer, and as an entrepreneurs, they do struggle a lot with boundaries. And because I think with that watery energy, and especially in the sign of Cancer, that is very protective of itself. It is a crab. It is that hard exterior of a very, very soft inside. So it is a tricky Mars to have, but there's such compassion there with that Mars in Cancer and Pisces. All of that kind of watery energy is beautiful, but it makes it really hard for Mars to operate in a constructive way. You've got to be very conscious of the way your Mars works, I think, when you have it in those water signs. What do you find with that?
Yeah, I agree. It brings passion into the emotional realms, and really the watery Marses want to put energy into healing, into nurturing, into nourishing, and into connecting in an intimate way with people. And the energy will come from intuition and from the gut rather than the head, for example, Mars in the air signs. So I think it's that idea of how do you act on things that are informed by your felt world or your emotional world. That will be it. And look, Mars in Cancer is one of its tricky positions. It is in what we call its fall. So there is this sense with Mars in Cancer. Mars wants to go straight ahead at things, whereas Cancer likes to circle, or even like the crab. Think about it. It only goes side to side. It can't go
sideways.
So it's like, okay, how do we get Mars to feel comfortable in that side to side? So I always think about Mars in Cancer as people who want to protect. It's like Arnie Schwarzenegger in Kindergarten Cop, like he goes from being a beat cop or, a detective into protecting and in a kindergarten environment. That's Cancer. So people who protect or defend a nation or a family or a clan, it's that energy. But I think especially with Mars in Cancer, it can be quite sensitive and ready to defend. So have to be careful am I reacting from a place that's realistic, or am I reacting because of past emotions? Because Cancer can take us into the past. And as for Mars in Pisces, it always makes me think of The Way of the Peaceful Warrior. That book, that movie, that idea of there's such a spiritual or an etheric energy to Pisces. It's like I want to assert myself, but in a way that brings harmony. So, my daughter, she studies jujitsu and taekwondo, and the idea isn't to fight. It's not to get into conflict, but if conflict meets you, it's knowing how to do it. So it's like a warrior monk, that has these high ideals about what human connection can be about, but is willing to fight to protect themselves when they can, but in a way that will be more about defense rather than actual reaction.
Yes. It's not kind of a proactive Mars. It's more of a defensive Mars. And in business, that can be a little bit tricky because your energy to go after something might be a little bit tempered. You might need to be more of a responder than a kind of initiator, compared with the Mars in Aries or Leo. That's going to be like, kind of driving forward.
And having a higher purpose too, that will give the mission, especially for Mars in Pisces, that sense of, okay, what's my higher purpose here? What's my soul or my spiritual purpose here? Can really help any of the water signs if it's struggling to move forwards. It's like, okay, I need to know my higher purpose to give me direction, to give me that focus, to help me get out of bed in the morning.
That's it. I also think with Mars in the water signs, there can be this tendency to really take things personally. Like you said about Cancer, I think it applies with Mars in Scorpio and with Mars in Pisces. If you've got Mars in a water sign, you've got to be really aware that when somebody says something to you, it doesn't necessarily mean it's personal. You've got to kind of remove that feeling from the interaction. Like you can be more likely to feel personally attacked by an email, for instance, which the person sending it might have had not that intention at all. But it's like there is that need, this constant kind of defense up. Like, is this personal or not? You've got to be really conscious of not taking things too heart, I guess, too personally.
It's a really good point, Sophia. And I think, when we're in those subconscious realms that the water signs are connected to, it's hard to see. You think about when you're scuba diving, you have to wear goggles to be able to see clearly. And even then it depends, your visibility may be only 5 meters. So it's often, okay, what do the messages really mean? And I think it's a really good point that you're saying, be really clear and as neutral as possible with those Marses.
Yeah. So that is Mars in the elements. I guess we've kind of gone a bit deeper into each of the signs. You've worked with people and their Mars for many years now. What's kind of a main takeaway, I guess, that you often give to your clients to help them work with their own Mars in a constructive way?
Yeah, so Mars is about how we get active and energetic. And I think for those with Mars in a fire sign or in a air sign, exercise is really good for your mental health. Getting our body moving, getting our blood pumping, these are ways to proactively use Mars. Because like Saturn, Mars is a trickier energy. It comes with its challenges as well as its gifts. If we can give it conscious and proactive ways to use it, then it won't act out in its own way. I have young children. I don't know how many of your listeners do. You know this too. If you just leave a toddler to run rampant, they will be destructive, and Mars can be the same. But if you can focus them, give them a task or give them an area that they can be constructive within, then that's better. So always with Mars, exercise. So Mars in a water sign may like swimming or supping or surfing or even dancing. Mars in fire signs, it's running, it's movement, it might be adventures or things like that. Mars in air signs, I think anything social or anything with balls, anything where you're moving through the air or you're talking, it engages conversation. Always makes me think about indoor netball or touch football or even breath work. So yoga and Pilates can be good for the air signs. Mars in earth signs, anything where you're fighting or challenging against gravity, wrestling, jiu-jitsu is great for that. Actually, any of the martial arts I do feel like are good for Mars in the earth signs, but also weightlifting, really getting into that. If you can feel gravity and push against gravity, that's really good for Mars in the earth signs too. And another remediation as well I find with Mars is listening to your anger in your body. listening to anger in your world, getting to know your anger signals, especially for those with Mars in water signs or Mars in some of those tricky, Taurus and Libra and Cancer, really knowing, okay, what is my body telling me about this anger? And therefore going, what's wrong? What do I need to remediate so I don't get into that reactive, that irritable, that frustration, that impatient side? The more shadow side of Mars can also be helpful there too. So they're the first two that kind of pop to mind for me.
Yeah, and that's so helpful. I think we need to, as entrepreneurs, and even just as parents or in life in general, we really have to be aware of our reactivity and give our Mars some tasks to do, some focus, so that it doesn't come out in destructive ways in our business, in our relationships, all of that sort of thing. And so I love those suggestions. I'm going to be doing a bit more of that, I think.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been such a wonderful conversation, and I hope the listeners got a lot out of this exploration of Mars today. Thank you so much, Alicia.
My pleasure. Thanks, Sophia.
Thanks for joining me on the Cosmic Business Breakthrough. If you'd like to learn more about what I do, head to sophiapalace.com or follow me at Sophia Palace over on Instagram. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, I'd love for you to take a moment and review the show if you found it helpful and share it with a few friends. Thanks again, and I'll speak to you next time.